Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the second session of the TUAC. My name is Tuncer Baykaş. I am the Vice Chair of IEEE Turkey. We are going to have 5 presentations in this session, but before that, I would like to introduce Assistant Professor of Applied Mathematics, Cengiz Pehlevan from Harvard University. He's going to make a talk about the reverse engineering of biological intelligence. I would like to give the short bio of him. His research interests are theoretical neuroscience and theory of neural computation. Pehlevan received his bachelor's degree in physics and electrical engineering from Boğaziçi University and a PhD in physics from Brown University. Before joining the Harvard faculty, he held research appointments as a Schwartz Fellow at Harvard and a postdoctoral associate at the Yanelia Research Campus and and worked as a research scientist at Flatiron Institute. Professor Pehlevan, floor is yours. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation to our conference.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure. So let me start by sharing my presentation. Let's see, and I hope you have the full screen.
Yes, we have. Thank you.
Okay, well, it's a great pleasure for me to be here. So I'm joining from Boston, so it's like 7 a.m. here, so I'm not fully coherent, so pardon me on that. I'm not following YouTube channel, so if you have questions, the organizers kindly agreed to forward them to me. Please feel free to ask any questions that you have. I'll try to answer everything as we go on. Yeah, so the topic of my today's talk is reverse engineering biological intelligence. And what do I mean by that? So I'm a professor of applied mathematics. So this talk is mostly going to be about mathematical modeling and reverse engineering intelligence through mathematical modeling. And what do we mean by mathematical modeling, first of all? And this is something as engineers, we do or we use all the time, but maybe we may not have thought about it in these terms. In other disciplines, like maybe applied mathematics and physics, maybe this is at more at the forefront of thinking. But here's what John von Neumann said about this. By a model is meant a mathematical construct which, with the addition of certain verbal interpretations, describes observed phenomena. Okay, so there's interesting things that he's referring to here, right? So we have to have a mathematical construct, but it has to come with some verbal interpretations, and we have to care about describing phenomena. This comes hand in hand with, the notion of understanding how things works, and that may be the thing that's leading to reverse engineering. So that's the philosophy here. The justification of such a mathematical construct is solely and precisely that it is expected to work, that is correctly to describe phenomena from a reasonable wide area. And so this is going to be another theme of this talk. So I'll be actually introducing you a brief history of mathematical models people have used to describe biological intelligence, and they'll be working at different levels, describing different kind of phenomena. And von Neumann also had an interesting criterion about, mathematical modeling. He said these mathematical models must satisfy certain aesthetic criteria, that is, in relation to how much it describes, it must be rather simple. And so that is also very true. Currently, our notions of understanding something or understanding mechanics of something go hand in hand with this notion of simplicity. So with that background and introduction, let me go back to what it is that I'm actually going to talk about. So you might remember this famous game that was played by Google's DeepMind. They came up with this computer code algorithm, or AlphaGo, which played this game Go with Lee Sedol, who was the world champion at that time. That was interesting because games like backgammon and chess have been played to the professional level by computers, and they had beaten human performance before. But Go was a bit of a special game because if I'm not an expert in this, but I've read and heard and talked to people that Go players are very intuitive, and like when they describe their strategies and tactics and so on and so forth, it's very intuitive. Sometimes even emotions come into play. So it sounded like a very human-like game as opposed to a more mechanistic one like maybe chess or backgammon, which we might even think is a probabilistic game. But what happened was basically AlphaGo won this game. And then there was particular moves. I mean, like, people were very like, oh, that's almost like a human playing this game, and so on and so forth. But what was going beyond in the background? In the background, basically, AlphaGo was running, all these, computers, and so just leaving aside all the engineering and training and development aspect of this algorithm, just at the moment that the game was going on, there was 1,200 CPUs and about 200 GPUs running to calculate, the next move of what this machine is going to do, as opposed to Sedol's brain, right? So this was basically the comparison. So one point I want to make is we do not understand how the brain works, and I want to make that point by just describing to you, comparing, some notions of some metrics of computation in machine and in the brain, and then basically using metrics that we as engineers might care about. So in what sense are these two computing machines, the brain and this CPU, GPU center, are comparable? Is one more efficient than the other one, and so on and so forth. And the point I want to make is, yes, one is going to be much more efficient in some certain senses, and that will point to my point that we do not understand how the brain works. So the brain is actually, is a very, very efficient data processing machine. And by efficient, I mean certain things. And for this particular point, I will mean energy efficiency. But even forget about, all the things about cortex and so on and so forth. Let's just go to the first, to the periphery of the nervous system. At the first time, some sensory information gets transmitted into neural code, and let's just look at the retina. So retina, this is retina's architecture. So actually, this is the front so this is where the light comes from, and this is the back of the retina. It's interesting, it says an inverted structure, meaning when the light comes and it falls on the back of the retina, and then goes through some multiple layers of neural processing. Right, so I'm using this terminology from neural networks, and the output of this retina comes from here through so-called ganglion cells, through the optic nerve, all the way back to the another area called LGN, and to the primary visual cortex. Now, you can actually get a sense of how much information retina processes. So, and that you can do through some back-of-the-envelope calculations. But basically, in the human retina, you understand that. The amount of information that falls onto retina per second is about on the order of 10 gigabits per second. Okay, so that's what happens here, and this information falls onto so-called photoreceptors. So there's about 125 million of them. So 125 million channels of information. Just falling onto retina. The output of the retina, on the other hand, is about 1 million channels. So there's about 1 million ganglion cells. And people have made estimates of how much information that carries, and that's on the order of 10 to 100 megabits per second. So there's a huge, point one. So if this was a live thing, I would have asked you, if I have an Ethernet cable plugged into your computer, what's the capacity of that cable? So that's on the order of same information content. It's about 10 to 100 megabits per second, depending on your connection, connection. So you can imagine basically two Ethernet cables going from your retina all the way to your cortex. So I want to point a few things, other things here, right? So what the retina does is a huge compression. So that's again something that you might have encountered in your classes, right? Going from 10 gigabits per second to 10 megabits per second. So that's a huge compression going on, and also compression in terms of data, and also some reduction in the numbers of channels. So you may call this dimensionality reduction, going from 125 million channels to 1 million channels, right? So basically, a huge chunk of information that receives doesn't even go to your brain. You don't even see that. Right? There's this whole big data processing reduction happening. Okay, so you can actually take this analogy further. So the world dumps information to the retina, 10 gigabits per second, then from there, Retina to central brain 10 megabits per second, and there's more processing going on. And basically, and this processing is in terms of reduction and extracting information that is relevant for, I don't know, thinking, rational reasoning, and so on and so forth. And, there are reputable, I'll say, cognitive scientists which estimate that conscious awareness is basically the information content of it is about 100 bits per second, right? So the brain is constantly doing this. It's a huge data reduction and meaningful information extraction machine. And you can ask, like, so how much computing power does it use to do that, or how efficient are its algorithms in doing that? Now, it's obviously efficient in the sense that it is able to extract meaningful information, right? So, which is beyond the capability of your current computers, but it's also efficient in the way that it does. I mean, so this is another quantity that as engineers we care about. It does this with about a power that is like 20 watts, okay? So that is extremely efficient in the following sense. I mean, this is the same order of magnitude of energy consumption as one CPU that is like the one in front of my computer as of now, plus minus, but same order of magnitude, as opposed to the thousands of, GPUs and CPUs that AlphaGo was running. And, where I live, this is basically corresponds to an electricity bill of $20 per year. So in current Turkish currency, that will be like, I don't know, but 180 and that somewhere between 160 and 180 liras. So, I mean, that's not expensive. So that's my point. So this introduction was just to quantify, well, we could quantify this in many ways, but here's one way of making the point that, I mean, the brain is a very efficient data processing machine, and we do not understand how it works. Right? So we do not have algorithms that are this efficient. So the question then is, I mean, how do we understand how that works? So, and this is I mean, people have been thinking about this for a long time, all through human history. And what I'm going to do is basically most of the talk go through the history a little bit. I picked some episodes, and those episodes are related to mathematical modeling, I mean, which gave some insight into how the brain works, and also had translations to sort of machine learning and artificial intelligence. And so I'll cover a few episodes there. And at the end, maybe if there's time, I might talk about a few of the current problems. I'm not going to pose any solutions to those problems. These are research areas, but I'll just pose the problems, so that might basically, interest you. Okay, so let's start with the story that I want to talk about. So just to make sure that we're on the same page, the brain is complex, right? So we're talking about here an organ that has about 100 billion neurons. Neurons are these cells that are thought to be the main information processing units in the brain, right? So, I mean, this is a picture of a neuron that I took from Wikipedia, basically. They have particular structure, cell bodies, axons, dendrites, and so on and so forth. And they communicate with each other chemically through synapses. Basically, what happens in a synapse is one neuron secretes some chemicals called neurotransmitters, and those chemicals reach the other neuron from axon to the dendrite of another neuron, and it starts some electrical signaling in the other neuron. And there's about 1,000 trillion synapses in the brain, so that's a huge number compared to the 100 billion neurons. And the way these neurons communicate is through something called an action potential, or spikes. I'll tell you a bit more about this in the next slide if you don't know about this. But how many spikes are in the brain? It's very hard to calculate, but just a rough number here, at least should be correct in the order of magnitude, is about, on average, 5 spikes per neuron per second. So that's a big network of processing units with lots of connections and lots of spikes or action potentials that are that lead to communication between these neurons. So this is the thing that we're trying to understand. So just so that, again, we're on the same page, I call this a spike, but that's a colloquial name for what's an action potential is. But an action potential is the following. So what we're seeing here is, again, a neuron. So these are its dendrites. These are the places where other neurons make connections to, and you receive chemical signaling. And then these chemical signals basically turn into some kind of electrical processing inside the cell right over here. And when basically what that leads to is a change in the membrane potential of this neuron. And when that membrane potential crosses a threshold, what happens is this neuron produces a wave of electrical activity. And that's what you're seeing over here. These are the potentials of the cell membrane outside and inside the axon. And then there's a sudden reversal. And that reversal basically travels around the axon and then reaches the synapse. And then basically that synapse is the contact to the next neuron. So there's interesting phenomenology about this that we should know. So an action potential is an all or a non-event, meaning a neuron either spikes if it crosses. This is the membrane potential. So you're seeing this is an input to that neuron. So if that input leads to a change in the membrane potential that is below the threshold, an action potential does not start. And if it crosses that threshold, an action potential starts and does its full course. So it's an all or none event. There isn't an action potential that is big or small. It either happens or it doesn't happen. It is a short event. It lasts a few milliseconds. So that's another thing you should know. And the way a neuron communicates that it's responding a lot or less is not by sending bigger or smaller action potentials, but sending a larger number or smaller number of action potentials. So the frequency of action potentials is modulated as opposed to their size. Okay, so these are a few things that we need to know. Okay. So the first thing mathematical modeling it's not the first time. Well, one of the first times mathematical modeling came into this was basically people trying to understand how this action potential generation works. Okay? And that actually led to a Nobel Prize. So basically, two physiologists, Hodgkin and Huxley, studied hard to understand basically, how is this action potential generated and what kinds of mechanisms are leading to it, and then also can we come up with a mathematical way to describe it, which predicts the shape of the action potential and its transmission along the axon. So what actually they came up with was basically an electrical circuit that describes this through some capacitances and resistances, and these also are state dependent and so on and so forth. But if you look at the equations they wrote, I mean that's very much alike what you would see in your circuits classes. And then they basically got the Nobel Prize for this in 1963. The particular system that they were studying was a squid, and squid has a so-called giant axon. Basically, this is one particular nerve cell that goes all the way through the body, and it's very thick, so it's actually almost visible. And so they were able to isolate this axon and put electrodes into it, and then do very meticulous experiments to see how this action potential generates, and that kind of mathematical equation inspired by this electrical nature of and circuit nature of everything. So, but nowadays we're able to, our technology has evolved much more than that, and we are able to record a lot of neurons simultaneously, and their action potentials. And at the end, what we get is basically something like this. So this is real data. This is from Michael Berry's lab at Princeton University. And this is a recording, again, from the retina. So salamander's retina. What's being done is basically a bunch of pictures are being shown to this animal. And they have some recording technology through which they get action potentials. So what we're seeing is the following. Each little rectangle here is a different cell. So you have cells that goes from cell A to cell U over here. Okay. And then, so each little dot here, the red dot that you're seeing, is an action potential that this cell produces. Now, within each rectangle, there are multiple, within each rectangle, there are multiple lines. So it's maybe most visible here. So you see there's this guy, there's no red dot here, and there's a red dot here, and so on and so forth. So what's happening here is basically the animal is seeing the same picture again and again and again. In some of these trials, each repetition is called a trial. This neuron responds here, but for example, it does not respond in those trials and responds again in this particular trial, and so on and so forth. So that's part of the mystery why there's a variability in the responses across different trials of the same picture. Okay, but the bigger picture, the bigger point I want to make is this is sort of like a Morse code. That is the nature of data that we are seeing, and this is the sort of puzzle that we need to solve. Looking into such kind of data, it's a bunch of a time series of all or none events across many neurons that we need to sort of decipher. So what is the brain, for example, in this particular case, what is the retina telling the brain or the rest of the brain, and can we understand that just by looking into this data set? That's a challenging question. Who knows? I mean, there is structure into it. Like you're seeing, like for example, this neuron seems to be, firing a lot or producing action potentials a lot, and other ones are not firing it as much. Or there seems to be certain, repetitions or points in time where the firing of these neurons are very persistent, right? I mean, every trial produces a lot of activity, and other areas produce not activity. For example, you see that in time, the firing with the action potential generation spikes, right? Almost all of these neurons are not continuously firing, they just fire at certain times. I mean, there's certain structure, it's not like just a random bunch of Poisson, events, okay? There's some structure, so how do we make sense of that? Okay, so sometimes we get lucky. Okay, so sometimes it is easy to make sense of actually this kind of data. So this is basically, I took this from a very famous study, and I should have cited this study, and I did not, but I'm sorry about that. So this is actually a recording from humans. Okay, it's from the medial temporal lobe. So you might ask, how do you record from a human brain? How do you put an electrode into it? So this is actually an electrode put into your brain, because there are some patients in a hospital, I mean, waiting for surgery, and sometimes they cooperate. Okay, so what's being done is the following. Patients are shown different pictures of different people, famous people. So so what you're seeing just below the picture is again the same sort of same kind of data from the previous slide. A neuron's response. So basically, every time you see a blue dot, this neuron is responding, and there are multiple lines here corresponding to multiple trials, meaning multiple repetitions of the same picture being shown to the person. And the other thing I want to say is, okay, so at the bottom row here, you're seeing a histogram in time of the number of action potentials. So what they do is, they bin these number of action potentials into time bins, and they count the number of action potentials produced in that time. So for example, so this neuron almost never produced an action potential to, I believe, Bill Clinton, and there are other famous celebrities over here. What was interesting was, okay, this neuron turns out to be a Hail Berry sort of a detector. So whenever this person is shown a picture of Hail Berry in different contexts, even as Catwoman in a movie, or even her name being written in text, right? Not even a picture of her, as opposed to, for example, Kobe Bryant's name written. Okay, this neuron showed very sort of elevated activity, as opposed to pictures of other people here and other, for example, I don't know, other American presidents and so on and so forth. So so I said sometimes we get lucky, because this is a very clear sort of picture of what this neuron is doing. I mean, also understand that, there's many neurons. These people who are doing experiments by just randomly, putting an electrode into the brain. So what is the probability of, you coming up with hitting a neuron that's responding to only Hail Berry? So that this must be, they tried many pictures, and, out of these pictures, one of them turned out to be such responsive. But there's all these things to think about here. But the point is, sometimes we get lucky, but most of the times not. So we do not get such clear correlations between our neuron's response to, let's say, what a person is seeing or doing at the moment. So most of the time, it's like a like it's like this, like a black box of just a bunch of dots that we have to make sense of. So how do we make sense of that? So at that point, I mean, if you think about it a little, I mean, you realize that what you really need is a theory of the brain as a computing machine. So we need to understand a computational paradigm or framework to think about how the brain works. And within that computational paradigm and framework, we might be able to give meaning to these kinds of signals. So the first for that kind of a theory is basically the one with McCullough and Pitts. And this theory actually might be, again, very familiar to you if you ever taken a basic logical circuits kind of a course where you were designing, I don't know, logical gates and so on and so forth. Actually, the title of the paper is called A Logical Calculus of the Idea's Immanent Nervous Activity, right? So here's sort of my way of introducing what their sort of reasoning was, okay? So they made, they noticed a few things, like that a neuron produces an all or none response is the major thing that they noticed. So they said, look, what that means is we could take a neuron's response and like basically let's ignore this trial-to-trial variability structure, okay? And that was also early in time. I'm not sure even if they had access to that kind of information, but they knew that a neuron's response was all or none, and that we can certainly think of this as basically a neuron's response. We can bin it in time and think of a neuron's response as basically a string of ones and zeros, right? A logical true and a logical false. Okay, so that's actually where we're starting about thinking about mathematical modeling. It involves some abstraction, right? So, and simplification of the complexity of the brain that involves all this huge machinery and biology and chemistry, but basically boiling it down to this logical sort of picture. Okay, a neuron is giving us logical truths and falses. And two, the second thing they realized was, or extracted or modeled, was the fact that there's some kind of a threshold crossing process going on. So they said, look, we know that if the input to a neuron is doesn't cross this fine threshold, the neuron does not respond, and if it does, it responds. So we can model this by this equation. So this is the first ever, artificial neural network neuron equation that's been written. It's called the McCullough and Pitts neuron. And then they said, look, we're going to have inputs to this neuron. These are going to be zeros and ones. These X's are the presynaptic neurons, the neurons that make contact with the postsynaptic neuron. And then their responses might be true or false, zeros or ones. And what this current neuron is going to do is it's going to add these responses with some weights. So these are W's, these are the weights, and compare that to a threshold, that's this B parameter over here. And if that sum is greater than B, my current neuron is going to produce an output 1. And if it's less than B, my current, sorry about that, my mouse is active. Okay, if that response is less than B, the neuron is going to produce 0. Okay, so each neuron is going to be doing the simple threshold crossing operation, and then I'm going to connect all of these neurons with static. I use this word static weight, and this these inputs are going to go from maybe the stimulus sensory organs, and the outputs might be our sort of motor organs and hands and legs and so on and so forth. And the brain is basically a big logical circuit that takes in these binary strings and produces a binary string. And if you read through their paper, it goes deep into this logical calculus. It's called a logical calculus, but they prove that because we're using these kinds of threshold crossing machines, you can build AND gates, OR gates, and you can prove universality and so on and so forth. Notions that you have seen in basic circuit design courses. So this was the first mathematical abstraction of how our brain works, and it has the hallmarks of mathematical modeling. They focus on certain aspects, throw away a lot of detail, but yet there are nice words that go with it, and there's a whole understanding that comes with it, right? So basically, the brain is a logical circuit, and of course, it has flaws. It's a very simplistic review of how the brain works, and we'll talk about that. It's nowhere true, but it has value in the sense that, it gives us a computational framework to think about, some of the things that the brain does, and we can actually, using these kinds of modeling and ideas, we can give meaning and even make predictions. This is one of the two places where I'm going to cite my own work. Even in 2011, we could use this logical circuitry modeling aspect of the brain to say something about, a behavior in a particular circuit. This is a fly larva. So what you're seeing here is, so this also slide gives you an understanding of what state of current neuroscience is. So we looked at a particular circuitry here. It's an olfactory circuitry. So these larvae, have chemical sensation, and then there's a particular area of early stages of olfactory circuitry, which I'm not going to go into the detailed biology of this, but this is basically a diagram, a picture of that circuitry. These are cell bodies. They make connections to other cells and so on and so forth. So through techniques called connectome, actually people can dissect the circuits and give us a connectivity diagram. So we know all these circuits. So this is basically different cells here on this matrix here and here. And these are the number of connections that these cells make with each other. So we have a whole connectivity diagram of this network. And then the other thing that our experimental colleagues did was basically, so these behavioral experiments. So this is a bunch of fly larvae, and they're in some kind of a petri dish, and there's a particular location where they would put an order. As in the beginning, they test basically, there's an order, and these larvae just don't care about it. They go in all directions. So when they feed the larva, they actually run away from sort of the odorant over here. So they all go away from it. But when they're hungry, they all go towards it. Okay. So there's some preference to go towards food when you're hungry and run away from it when you're not hungry. So what our friends did was basically they went to the circuitry and basically killed, through some experimental techniques, each neuron almost one by one. Okay, and then looked at this behavior. It turns out if you kill certain neurons, you don't run away from food when you're fed. It turns out when you kill certain other neurons, when you're even hungry, you don't go to food. And so there's a whole sort of different behavioral states that the animal is in, depending on what parts of the circuit are functioning or not. So it turns out you can explain all of this by taking this connectivity diagram and plug it into this Coulomb-Pitts type neurons in a logical circuitry, and just making it produce these 1 and 0 output, which is if the output is 1, the network, the larva goes through to the larva, to the food. If it's 0, if it goes away from the food. And all these perturbation experiments can be captured just by this kind of very simple logical circuit model. All right, so the point of this going through this was even simplest models, mathematical models, might have some truth in them, and they might have applications in the modern times that you can understand, complicated behavior in the real brain using these kinds of models. But of course, the brain is not a logical circuit. It does much more than that. And so one of the, of course, things that was missing in that picture actually was pointed out by Rosenblatt. And what he noticed was basically saying, look, the picture of Coulomb-Pitts is a static, so the brain is a static object is not true, because obviously we learn new things, right? And we adapt to our environments. So therefore, our responses to the same stimulus change over time. So therefore, something obviously must be changing in our brain, right? So what is it in this whole sort of picture that was put forward by Coulomb-Pitts is changing in response to changing while we're learning things, okay? So, for example, a key intuition was it must be these weights. These are the connection strengths between neurons that must be changing. Okay? And then there's physiological evidence for this. I mean, people have done many experiments showing that the connections between neurons change as a function of the activity profiles of pre and postsynaptic neurons. Okay, so and not only he pointed that these are the things that must be changing, he actually came up with a way to update these weights, and that is called the perceptron learning algorithm. So this algorithm is basically still at the heart of current, if you ever heard of deep networks and so on and so forth. There are a bit more sophisticated versions of the algorithms with which these networks learn, are still a bit more sophisticated versions of this perceptron learning algorithm. So just to give you the geometry of how this works, right? So the obvious point to make is, okay, this is just a dot product, okay, w dot x. Okay, so what does this have to do with anything? Well, so you can think of this machine, this Y machine, this perceptron, well, the McCullen-Pitts neuron, as basically a separator, a linear separator. What do I mean by that? So let this be basically our space. So I'm just plotting 2 dimensions here, but you might have n dimensions, okay? So this this W is basically this. So there's a hyperplane here. This is blue line, okay? Every point on one side of this hyperplane leads this neuron to produce an output 1, and every point on the other side of this hyperplane leads this neuron to produce an output 0. So W is basically the vector perpendicular to this hyperplane, and B is basically the margin, how far this hyperplane is away from the origin. And so I'm assuming the particle normalization here, W is unit norm, but the picture is correct, more or less. Okay, so so basically what this machine does is it just takes the whole space and just divides it into 2 halves, okay, 0 and 1. Okay, so that's a simple machine actually, if you think about it. That's what it does. All right, but the point is then, what is the correct hyperplane, right? I mean, so if each neuron is going to do this, but what is it for each neuron? Then the question is finding the correct hyperplane to do this. Okay, so we can think of a scenario which is called supervised learning. Suppose someone told this particular neuron, okay, what the correct answer was, meaning like I gave this neuron a bunch of x's and a bunch of correct associations that it needs to make. So for this particular x vector, produce 1, or for this other particular x vector, produce 0. Okay, so perceptron learning algorithm basically is a way to update these weights based on such examples. So this is called supervised learning. It's called supervised because it's a supervision signal, which means that someone tells you what the correct answer is. Okay, so here eta is just a learning rate, it's a parameter. So this is what the correct answer is. This is what the perceptrons output without knowing what the answer was to the input. If they are the same, meaning the perceptron produced the correct answer, so this guy is 0, meaning that the perceptron should not change these weights. If there's a mismatch between the correct answer and the perceptron's output, then this is a positive number, and you should be basically updating the synaptic weight. So what this machine does is, it sees a bunch of inputs, produces outputs. If the prediction is correct, don't do anything. If the prediction is wrong, change something. Okay. And why does this work? So let's see an example over here. Okay. Now suppose this was an example. Okay. And this is the current hyperplane of the perceptron. Now it's on the right side of this, so meaning the W and X has basically, and here in this particular case, we set the bias to 0. So W dot X is a positive number, therefore the perceptron is producing a positive output. Okay, but suppose the correct output was 0, right? The network was supposed to produce 0 instead of 1, right? So let's just go to our perceptron update rule. So that's a 0, that's a 1. The difference between them is basically a number, a vector that is in the negative direction of X. So we can update our synaptic weight by a vector that is in the negative direction of X. So this is our new current W vector. So notice that if we see the same, so with that W vector, this is our current separating hyperplane. And that separating hyperplane sets now this side to output 1 and that side to an output 0. And now, as you see, the previously incorrectly classified X is now correctly classified. Okay? So this is the nature of how this algorithm works. So, I mean, Rosenblatt was basically very optimistic about this. So this is actually a picture of him. So the machine that you're seeing beyond is exactly doing all this computation. It's updating these weights and calculating and so on and so forth. And then here's him trying to, learn a classifier, how to tell a C, and whether teach a machine. So, I mean, if you read news from that era, you can read him saying things like, in 10 years or something, we'll figure out how the brain works and so on and so forth. But that didn't happen. But the main sort of the lesson is there. And the idea that learning in artificial networks is about basically dynamic synaptic weights. The connections between these neurons are adaptive and to the task, environment, so on and so forth. And what that means is there needs to be learning algorithms. Now, there's a plethora of these different kind of learning algorithms and learning setups and types and frameworks and supervised, unsupervised, reinforcement learning, curriculum learning, this learning, that learning, tons of things, and all come with different kinds of ways. But this basic notion started here. And then, if you have never played with neural networks, I do suggest this particular website. It's called playground.tensorflow.org. It has a very visual sort of user interface. You can set up these networks and train them and give them data and so on and so forth. So I'm not going to go into this stuff, but I'll just go to my next episode. But okay, so now we understand. Okay, so we talked about modeling a single neuron. Modeling a single neuron, and then, but of course, I mean, the thing that does the computation is not a single neuron, but it's the whole network of neurons. So at some point, you have to realize or ask the question to yourself is that, okay, how do we actually, make a network of these neurons? How do you connect them? What is the right architecture? Okay, and the answer to that also, I mean, was highly motivated from biology, and again, a Nobel winning prize work of these physiologists, especially that of Hubel and Wiesel. Now, I'm sure you're seeing the theme here. I mean, in this quest, there's always a motivation from biology, which is backed up by mathematics, and it's basically leading to some kind of technological advance. Right. I mean, is that a coincidence? Probably not, because the only known example of an intelligent machine is the brain. So so it's not a coincidence that the inspiration comes from there. Okay, but I should also point that, I mean, everyone, all these people that are involved in this is also sort of people who are all they know biology, they know mathematics, they know engineering. So there are people who can cross disciplines. That's maybe another lesson to take from the history that I'm describing here. Okay, so what did Hubel and Wiesel do? So these were very famous physiologists, and so what they were trying to do was they were trying to understand basically the visual cortex, and especially the primary visual cortex. Primary visual cortex is the area of cortex where visual information reaches first after leaving retina. Okay, and the way they were doing was basically they took a cat and they put like an electrode into this primary visual cortex and just was recording from random neurons over there, while showing the cat some different movies of stuff. Okay, and one particular stimulus that they tested their setup on, that really groundbreaking insight and discovery, and those were basically stimuli consistent of just bars, a blank screen and a bar and a moving bar. So I'm going to just play you a video. I hope you will hear the voice of it. So what you're going to see in this video is okay, so let me explain what's going to happen. So a simple cortical cell refers to a particular cortical cell. There's going to be a complex cell. I may not have time to show the video for it. There's a simple cell, there's a complex cells. So ignore the simple. Okay, and what you're going to hear is basically some dot, 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 click, click, click kind of signals, sounds. Those are basically action potentials of a neuron. So what they did was that they connected the electrical recording from a neuron to an amplifier so you can hear action potential generation. And on the screen, what you're going to see is what the animal is seeing. Okay. So as of now, I'm not seeing it. This is basically neuron producing action potential. Now you're seeing a bar in the screen. If you heard that, the neuron started responding fast. No response, fast response, no response, fast response. So now what they're going to do is they're going to start marking the location of the bar that this neuron is responding fast, so that's what X is at. But notice that if I start moving the bar a little, the neuron stops responding. So if the bar is there, the neuron is not responding. If the neuron is in the original equation, it's responding. If the bar is above, again, the original equation, the neuron is not responding, and so on and so forth. So I'll let the video play and talk over it. So they basically, as you're seeing, they're trying multiple versions of the stimulus. What happens if I make the bar longer? What happens if I make the bar shorter? At some point, they'll start changing the orientation of the bar, meaning it will become horizontal and vertical and so on and so forth. And then and what they will find is that, the orientation of the bar matters too. So what they marked is the following. These X's are the locations of the bar where this makes this neuron fire a lot. And these triangles are the places basically where the bar where the neuron does not fire. Now they're trying another thing. You're seeing that when the bar changes orientation, this neuron does not fire at all. Bingo. Okay. Yeah, amazing. So by doing such kind of experiments, they made a map, basically a real map of how the primary visual cortex. So it turns out primary visual cortex in certain types of animals are made into so-called columns and hypercolumns. And columns are basically what they refer to is a number of neurons or a neighborhood of the cortical surface or volume, let's say, where neurons respond to bars of a particular orientation and not to other orientations, and there is certain logic of how all these things are organized. The other thing to note here is a cortical neuron responds to only a small patch of visual scenery. For example, if you hold your hand at an arm's length, the size of your thumb is basically what a neuron responds to. It doesn't respond to anything beyond that. So they came up with this whole architecture. The interesting thing was basically not too far away from that in time, people who were working on in the industry and in engineering, who were trying to make artificial neural networks work, immediately make a note of that work and took that architecture and plugged it into their circuits. So if you ever played with so-called convolutional neural networks, you might have noticed that these networks have a particular feed-forward architecture, meaning they have layers of neurons. Okay, that directly came from that was inspired from hierarchical processing in visual cortex, which is basically different areas, V1, V2, V4, so on and so forth. They seem to do different things. And these simple and complex cells, these ideas actually directly map to the ideas of a convolution and sampling and pooling. And these are operations that are all in deep networks. We don't know what they are. But the bigger point I'm trying to make is basically the architecture of the current convolutional neural networks was also inspired by the brain directly. And then so much so that if you look at the original paper about this, it's a paper by Fukushima, it's called Neocognitron. The title is very nice, a self-organizing neural network model for a mechanism of pattern recognition unaffected by shift in position. This shift in position was referring to the fact that in the brain, each neuron responds to a local patch, but in a way that the brain covers the whole visual scene, which in turn leads to a shift in variance, roughly speaking. If you look at the first figure of this paper, but Fukushima was basically referring to is exactly that work, correspondence between the hierarchy model by Hubel and Wiesel, the Nobel Prize winning work from the cat brain, and the neural architecture of neocognitron, and he was describing Retina, LGB, simple and complex cells. So we talked about simple cells, we didn't talk about complex cells, and so on and so forth. And the grandmother cell here refers to Hell-Bear-like cells, that only refers to particular concepts. Okay. And of course, this work grew and became very influential and led to a Turing Award to computational to people who were running this recent deep learning revolution. And the person on the right, Jan LeCun, is also one of the people who are famous for the particularly for convolutional neural networks. And here's another picture, basically, that's trying to make the connection between, at least the architectural similarity between some of the artificial neural networks, and these are the architectures of the particular layers of the brain. Okay. Now, so I'm in 50, I think 750. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you, just maybe one or two more things, and then try to finish. Okay. All right. So, okay, maybe this might be the last thing I want to say. Now, we talked about taking inspiration from the brain to say something about artificial neural networks. I just want to also point that there's a recent trend. This trend has been there, but I think it's made much more strong in the last years, as using deep learning and neural networks as models of the brain. So now it's a reverse question. Right? So we were trying to take inspiration from, or try to reverse engineer brain to come up with better neural networks to do maybe artificial intelligence. It turns out you can also use these models to make mathematical models of the brain itself. So here's an example of this. So this is a figure taken from the famous paper by Cengiz and Di Carlo, both were at my name is here at MIT. Okay, so what's being shown here is the following. So what they did was the following. So they took a neural network and trained it to classify a bunch of images. Okay. So that's one. Actually, they did not do that. They looked at many sort of networks which were trained to classify a certain bunch of images. And then they took these images and showed it to macaque monkeys. And then they also showed the same images to neural networks. And then they tried to compare the responses of neurons in the artificial neural network to neurons in the real brain. Okay, so here's what we're seeing. So let's look at this figure, for example. So here in the x-axis is a bunch of different images. So each point here is a different image. So we are seeing 3 examples of images here. So the red line here, okay, corresponds to a neural network. It's an artificial neuron, okay, in a neural network, and how that neuron responds to these images. Now, I'm simplifying this, but they were looking what was not actually a particular neuron, but a linear combination of neurons. But anyway, we can, for our purposes, we can think of this as a single unit. And on the black line here is basically a neuron from the IT, inferior temporal cortex of the monkey, okay, and its response to this particular set of images. So what they found was this impressive match. So there was a unit, or let's say a linear combination of the responses of the units in a deep neural network, whose responses was exactly as that of the responses of the brain. So much so that basically here's a plot. So on the y-axis is basically how much predictive of the brain's responses an artificial neural network is. And on the x-axis is the categorization performance, or how well that network performs in an image processing, image classification task. And each dot here is a different neural network model. The better performing a neural network model is, the better predictive of it is of the brain. And also there's a match between layers of the network to the layers of the brain, meaning earlier layers in a neural network are more predictive of earlier layers of the brain, and so on and so forth. Okay, so this was a remarkable sort of comeback, right? So start from the brain, go to AI, but then AI seems to come back and be a mathematical model of the brain. But is that it? No, and we still have a lot to learn from the brain. Yeah, so I'll stop here, Tunjara, and let me know. I mean, I can maybe speak for another few minutes or not. So it's up to
You have some more minutes, so we still have time, so you can continue.
So let me give you maybe just one more. So just pose a question about what is it that we have, what one thing that we might have to learn from the brain, and that's also one topic of my current research topics. And that has to do with the notion of so-called inductive bias. Okay, so here's one of the Jeff Hinton, another one of these Turing Award winners, says about the brain. He makes the following point. The brain as a learning machine has this problem. The brain has about 10 to the 14 synapses, but we only live about 10 to the 9 seconds. Okay, so if you think of each synapse as a parameter to fit, right? So this is a big parameter fitting machine. We have orders of magnitude more parameters than, let's say, the stimulus we receive, right? So think of supervised learning. Somebody has to give us 10 to the 5 supervision signals. This is a cat, this is a dog, or something, 100,000 to be able to fit all of this data. So obviously we're not getting this. Okay, so what's happening? Okay, so this, even if we assume that we need that one parameter, to one data point to fit a parameter, right? So that at least not to overfit. Okay, so he was arguing for unsupervised learning. Maybe that might be a reason where this kind of data might be coming from. So I just want to make the point of the point here. What happens if you have much smaller number of, much larger number of parameters than data? And you might have seen this picture if you ever tried to do some interpolation in numerical methods class, right? So so suppose this is our data, and we want to fit to it, a polynomial. The polynomial can be a line or a quadratic, or something that is of order, I don't know, probably, I don't know, 20, 30 polynomial or something. Obviously, I mean, we don't want to fit every point because there's noise here. So we'll be overfitting, and overfitting is basically means we will not be making good predictions. There's something that's not what this data set is. This seems like not a good strategy either. This is underfitting, meaning like, we don't capture anything about data, but there's a sweet spot here that is just right? So you want to fit up like a quadratic to this kind of data, not a 20th degree polynomial. Okay, but the brain is in this regime, meaning it has many parameters than data, yet obviously we're not overfitting because we're functioning and we're alive, right? So the brain is not overfitting despite being overparameterized. How is that happening? Right? And that relates to this question of inductive bias. Now, I don't know German, but I'm told that this is the word for triangle in German, so please correct me. Suppose I give you this picture and I tell you, well, I gave the answer to you, but this word, right? You could make many possible conclusions from this, right? You could think that this is a triangle or blue or equilateral triangle or blue equilateral triangle and so on and so forth, right? So what does this word? Well, it means a triangle, but how would you know that before someone told it to you? So inductive bias are these factors that guide a learner to choose one generalization from data over another one, right? So you could conclude many things about this picture just before I told you what the correct word was. And the points I want to make is that generalization relies on inductive bias. You always bias, this induction step always requires a bias towards one thing versus another one. And there's never learning without it. And obviously, good generalization performance depends on suitable inductive biases, meaning that, what your bias must match the task at hand. You can ask the question, what are the inductive biases of neural networks? So I'm going to do the same experiment to you, and I'm going to take a neural network with 2 layers and 10,000 parameters, and I'm going to make it fit just 2 points. Okay, so this is what it is. It's x-axis and y-axis, and these are the 2 data points that I'm going to give this neural network, and I'm going to make supervised learning on it. Okay, so this is obviously a very expressive machine. It can fit any kind of crazy functions to this 2 points. But if you turn on take the modern machinery of deep learning and apply it to these 2 points and want it to TensorFlow or whatever it is that you use, okay, you'll find that this neural network will end up fitting basically more or less aligned to this, these 2 points. Okay? So among all the possible explanations that this network could choose, all the functions that it could fit to these 2 points, it chose to fit a line, okay? So there's some kind of an Occam's razor going on over here, that neural networks are strongly biased towards simple functions. And the questions are basically, what is it that make them strongly biased towards simple functions? Can we understand such bias of overparameterized neural networks towards such simplicity? Where are these biases are stored? And so on and so forth. And just want to finish with just one paper of ours that we looked into this. I'm not going into the details, so you can go and check. And my final point is learning given importance? We talked all this talk about learning and learning and learning, but if you talk to any biologist, they'll tell you in most animals, the brains are functioning from birth. So a lot of behavior is innate. It's not even learned. So I think that's a whole almost unexplored domain in artificial intelligence that we take lessons from the brain. We have so much focus on learning, but actually learning actually constitutes a very little portion of intelligent behavior. Okay. Conclusion: we still have a lot to learn from the brain, and mathematics is important in that quest. Thank you, and I'm very sorry for going over time.
Thank you very much, Professor Pehlevan. We received a couple of questions. I would like to start with the Professor Tümer's. The first question of his was, would you like to tell us about your research you conducting up? You mentioned a little bit, and are all the members of your team mathematicians? How are you working with the other?
Yeah, that's very good. Actually, my current group is a mix of many people. So actually, they come from backgrounds in engineering, physics, applied mathematics, also experimental neuroscientists. So again, this is a very interdisciplinary field. So yeah, people come from all different backgrounds. But I mean, obviously, mathematical maturity is important.
Thank you. And another question was from Halil Said Cankurtaran. He's asking that how close are we to achieve a more general intelligence by modeling the human brain? So he always says that it's like 10 to 20 years away, but it never comes. So what do you say?
Yeah, I mean, it's very hard to guess. Whatever number I'm going to say is going to be wrong, but I can say that we are very far away. Yeah.
Another question came about that will your studies could be used to developing therapies to neurodiseases such as Alzheimer's and so on?
That's a very interesting question. I would say there is an emerging field called computational psychiatry. So this is different than computational neuroscience. And the goal there is to use computational and mathematical modeling to understand such disease and maybe come up with cures. But it's in its infancy, I would say. So it's a very emerging field, but hopefully it will make progress. So I'll just Google computational psychiatry and you'll see a lot of resources in this.
Okay, thank you very much for this one. So I would like to thank Professor Pehlevan for his wonderful talk. This ends our keynote part of the second session. So in 2 to 3 minutes, we will start with the student presentation.